We're celebrating Hooray for Hollywood today. I'm going to give you a little history here I think you'll find interesting. The very first film produced in Hollywood was in 1906. It was called The Daring Hold-Up, and it was produced by the Biograph Company. And the first studio to open in Hollywood was called the Centaur Studio, and that was in 1911. And before Hollywood came, all the motion pictures were produced in New Jersey and New York. But as producers found the wide open spaces of Los Angeles and the ideal climate to make films, those big epic westerns and adventure films, they started moving out. And by 1915, Hollywood was producing more films than New Jersey and New York combined. And by the late 1920s, all of the 5 major studios were in operation. MGM, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, RKO, and Paramount. And in the early 20s, we had those silent films. How many of you have seen silent films? Anybody? Used to go to the theater in the Oregon, like at the Alabama Theater, the organ pops up and they play the music, right? Well, some of those great films during that silent era were Phantom of the Opera, Birth of a Nation, Metropolis, and City Lights. And some of those great classic legends of the silver screen were Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino and Buster Keaton, and Douglas Fairbanks. And who? Someone said just something? What? W.C. Fields. And some of those leading ladies were Clara Bow, Mary Pickford, Marlene Dietrich. Great times. But then we moved into 1927. And you know what happened in 1927? Start making sound films, films with sound in them. And the very first one, I've told this story before, a little differently. The very first sound picture or talking picture, does anybody know what it was in 1927? The Jazz Singer, remember that? With Al Jolson. And one of the most famous lines from that film was, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. And that film marked the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood, which lasted for over 20 years. And during that time, you know, Hollywood knew that it was important to make all kinds of films because the audiences were yearning for films, were yearning for entertainment because they were struggling during the Great Depression and World War II, and I'm sure many of you experienced those years. So Hollywood produced those grand, lavish musicals and epic costume adventures and westerns and suspense and comedy and drama and romantic films to keep people happy during those hard, troubling times. Now, that era only lasted for 20 years. And during that 20-year period, the Hollywood studios were in control. They were the ones that all the employees, all the actors and actresses and directors and producers and cinematographers and editors all worked for the studio and got paid a weekly salary. Not like today. So the studios created those great legends on the silver screen, like Clark Gable, Cary Cooper, and Jimmy Stewart, and James Cagney, Tyrone Power. There's many, many more. And some of those leading ladies of the silver screen, like Myrna Lohr, Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis.
Alice Faye.
Alice Faye. Well, she was more in the, well, yeah, she was part of that era, yes. Very good. But in 1939, can you imagine this? In 1939 was the year, according to the American Film Festival, many film critics, and of course myself, Dick Sagrato, is the year that produced more of the greatest films in one year than in any other year. That's an 85-year history. Can you imagine that? Many great films in that one year. Perhaps you'll recognize them. Maybe you've seen them. Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Destry Rides Again, Gunga Din, Roaring Twenties, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and the list goes on. Today, that's not the case. Today, there's maybe 1 or 2 films that's produced during a year that in the last 10 or 15 years that are really classified as great films. I think what they're doing today is producers are producing films geared to a certain audience. And the audience they're gearing those films to are the younger generation. And the younger people today are so actively involved in those games, those PlayStations and things. And what are those games all about, right? Robots and zombies and wars and crashes and things. So Hollywood says, let's take advantage of that. Let's make films with all of that. So that's why you have today's most popular films are violent, sexually graphic, extreme language. You have robots and zombies and battles and computer-generated graphics. And it's not real. It's just not real. And that's why those old films are so popular.